What if I told you that in October 1962, our world teetered on the edge of nuclear destruction? Yes, that's right. For 13 tension-filled days, the globe stood still, awaiting the fate decided by two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. This was the Cuban Missile Crisis, a moment in history that brought humanity to the brink of annihilation. In the early 60s, the world was already caught in the chilling grip of the Cold War, a geopolitical tug-of-war between the capitalist West and the communist East. The United States, led by President John F. Kennedy, and the Soviet Union, under Nikita Khrushchev's leadership, were locked in an ideological battle, each striving for global dominance. Amidst this backdrop, the island nation of Cuba emerged as a critical pawn on this global chessboard. Following its socialist revolution led by Fidel Castro, Cuba found an ally in the Soviet Union. This alliance was a direct challenge to the United States, which had long held dominance in the Western Hemisphere under the Monroe Doctrine. The tensions escalated when the US attempted to overthrow Castro's regime in the infamous Bay of Pigs invasion of April 1961. The invasion was a dismal failure, further strengthening Castro's rule and pushing Cuba even closer to the Soviets. The Soviets, seizing this opportunity, decided to place nuclear missiles in Cuba. These missiles were capable of reaching the United States mainland, posing a direct and immediate threat to American national security. This was the powder keg that set the stage for the Cuban Missile Crisis. For 13 days in October 1962, the world watched in fear and anticipation as the two superpowers squared off, each threatening the other with mutual destruction. The stakes had never been higher, the world had never been closer to a nuclear apocalypse. So how did these tensions culminate into the most dangerous moment in human history? Stay tuned as we delve deeper into the Cuban Missile Crisis, a pivotal moment that forever changed the course of history. Imagine the shockwaves that ran through the White House when they discovered Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. It was a morning like any other in October 1962 when the CIA brought in a set of photographs for President Kennedy to peruse. These weren't your run-of-the-mill holiday snaps, though. These images, taken by a high-flying U-2 spy plane, revealed an unsettling truth: Soviet missile installations under construction in Cuba. The missiles in question were no small matter. They were medium-range ballistic missiles, capable of reaching major cities within the United States in a matter of minutes. The threat was real, and it was right on America's doorstep. The USA was suddenly under the shadow of nuclear destruction, a prospect that sent chills down the spines of everyone in the Oval Office. President Kennedy's response was measured yet decisive. He immediately convened a meeting with his top advisors, forming the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM, as it came to be known. This group was tasked with one of the most critical jobs in human history: to negotiate the USA out of potential nuclear war. The atmosphere in the room was tense, the stakes were high, and the margin for error was razor-thin. The committee members knew that their decisions in the coming days would shape the course of history. They had to weigh the options carefully, balancing the need for immediate action with the potential for catastrophic consequences. The options were limited. A full-scale invasion could provoke a nuclear response. A surgical airstrike might not eliminate all the missiles. A naval blockade could be seen as an act of war. Diplomacy was tricky, with the Soviets showing no signs of backing down, and doing nothing was simply not an option. As the meeting stretched into the night and the next day, the gravity of the situation weighed heavily on everyone present. The world was on the precipice of nuclear war, and the fate of millions rested on their shoulders. The clock was ticking, and a course of action had to be decided upon. As the world unknowingly danced on the precipice of disaster, the Kennedy administration wrestled with their response. The stakes were high, and the margin for error was razor-thin. The administration had to decide how to navigate this crisis without igniting a global conflict. The Kennedy administration, in a state of grave concern, considered various options. From a direct military invasion to diplomatic negotiations, the spectrum of choices was broad and fraught with risk. The decision-making process was a heated one, with the president's advisors divided and the tension in the room palpable. A direct military intervention was one of the options on the table, but such an action could potentially escalate the situation, leading to a full-blown war. It was a gamble the administration was not willing to take. Another option was diplomatic negotiations. However, this approach had its own set of risks. It would require the United States to make concessions to the Soviet Union, possibly undermining American credibility on the global stage. After much deliberation, the Kennedy administration decided on a middle ground approach, a naval blockade around Cuba. This action, termed a quarantine to avoid the term blockade, which traditionally implied war, was designed to prevent further missile shipments from reaching Cuba. It was a show of strength without the direct aggression of military action. Alongside the blockade, the United States demanded the removal of the missiles already in Cuba. This was a non-negotiable condition for the Kennedy administration. It was a clear signal to the Soviet Union that the United States was prepared to stand its ground while also leaving the door open for a peaceful resolution. With the blockade in place, the world watched, its collective breath held in anticipation. The chessboard was set, the pieces were moving, and the world waited to see how the Soviets would respond. The next move was theirs, and the fate of the world hung in the balance. With the blockade in place, the world waited with bated breath for the Soviet response. For 13 harrowing days, the world stood still as two superpowers stared each other down. The Cuban Missile Crisis had turned the planet into a global chessboard, with the United States and the Soviet Union playing a high-stakes game of brinkmanship. Imagine, if you will, the pressure cooker that was the White House Situation Room during this period. The air was thick with tension as the United States, led by President Kennedy, tried to navigate the treacherous waters of diplomacy with the Soviet Union, led by Premier Khrushchev. A significant event during these 13 days was the shooting down of a U-2 spy plane over Cuba. This was an American aircraft sent to gather intelligence about the missile sites. The death of the pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson, only served to heighten the tension. It was a stark reminder of the very real human cost that could result from any misstep in this delicate dance of diplomacy. Parallel to this, there was a flurry of letters exchanged between Kennedy and Khrushchev. These were not your usual diplomatic communiques, filled with pleasantries and veiled threats. No, these were stark, honest, and at times desperate pleas for peace. In one such letter, Kennedy wrote, "It is in the final analysis the responsibility of the leaders of nations to prevent war." He was not just writing to Khrushchev. He was speaking to the world. As these 13 days continued, the world watched, waited, and hoped. There was a collective held breath, a silent prayer that cooler heads would prevail. And then, finally, on the 13th day, a breakthrough. Khrushchev agreed to dismantle the missile sites in Cuba, and in return the USA promised not to invade Cuba and to dismantle its own missile sites in Turkey. On the brink of disaster, a resolution was finally reached. It was a resolution born out of a desire for peace, a recognition of the horrific consequences of nuclear war, and perhaps most importantly, the courage to step back from the brink. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended not with a bang, but with a secret deal and a promise. A promise that would not only bring an end to the immediate threat, but also shape the course of Cold War relations for years to come. In the tense final moments of the crisis, a secret agreement was struck. The Soviet Union agreed to dismantle and remove their missile sites in Cuba. In return, the United States secretly promised to dismantle their own missile sites in Turkey and Italy, and more importantly, pledged not to invade Cuba. This secret negotiation not only diffused the immediate crisis, but also set a precedent for future diplomatic negotiations. The resolution of the crisis had a profound and lasting impact on the Cold War dynamics. It underscored the importance of communication between adversaries. The installation of a direct hotline between the White House and the Kremlin was a testament of this realization. This hotline, often referred to as the Red Telephone, aimed to prevent a similar crisis from spiraling out of control due to miscommunication or delayed responses. The crisis also brought about a significant shift in nuclear arms control. It highlighted the terrifying reality of a nuclear war, leading to the signing of numerous treaties aimed at limiting the proliferation of nuclear weapons. The Partial Test Ban Treaty of 1963, which prohibited nuclear tests in the atmosphere, underwater and in space, was one of the first major steps in this direction. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a turning point in history. It not only brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, but also served as a wake-up call for the superpowers. It forced them to reconsider their strategies and highlighted the importance of diplomacy and dialogue in resolving international conflicts. The Cuban Missile Crisis serves as a stark reminder of how close humanity can come to its own destruction, and the importance of diplomacy and communication in averting disaster. It was a crisis that changed the course of history and continues to shape international relations, reminding us of the precarious balance on which our world stands.